Hi guys, our lesson on 13.2 will be in two parts. This is part 1. We are looking at the pituitary gland. We'll discuss the posterior pituitary first today. And remembering that the pituitary gland is the master gland because of those two parts, the front anterior with a whole lot of hormones and the back with two other hormones that are released and controlling many parts of the body. There is this function of the hypothalamus making the hormones that came from the posterior pituitary. So you can see these neurosecretory cells. You will not have to know about them, but I'll just tell you that what they do is make the hormones for the posterior pituitary, the ADH and oxytocin, are actually made up here, and they will be sent down through these secreting neurons and stored in the posterior pituitary. The feedback loops for those will indicate that, so that's why I'm mentioning it. On the other hand, all the anterior pituitary hormones are actually made by these glandular cells here that make those anterior hormones. The picture here that you have in your notes, it would be great to differentiate those two parts of the pituitary. So I'm just showing you that you could highlight the posterior, I've got it in pink here, and the anterior in yellow, and I put the abbreviations for those hormones in there. You can see that they're what we mentioned in our first topic, that the posterior, the back here, makes ADH for reabsorbing water. It also makes oxytocin with its two functions, uterine contractions and milk letdown. The front there, the anterior pituitary, as review, makes thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone from the cortex here, the outer part of the adrenal gland, remembering that that's over top of the kidney. Makes prolactin for milk production, human growth hormone, as well as the sex hormones LH and FSH. You can make sure that you're filling these out, and I mentioned before to make yourself a chart of which two hormones come from the posterior and which 6 hormones come from the anterior pituitary. You should know where they come from. That you will have to know. The first one we'll talk about is ADH, and this is a review hormone from Biology 20, because we did discuss how it is released in response to dehydration, as well as low blood pressure. So when you have less water, your blood pressure is down, blood volume is down, so it will be the stimulus for ADH release. And what will happen there is that the kidney tubules will be stimulated to reabsorb more water and keep it in the blood. So you can see in this diagram that this is the nephron here where the filtrate is moving through, and the bloodstream is sending out the hormone ADH to the kidney itself, the kidney tubules, the nephrons, and that will stimulate, instead of all of that filtrate turning into watery urine, the water here is reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So we will be keeping more of our water in the body and concentrating the urine. So ADH will then be shut down with negative feedback once the blood volume is back to normal. And we saw this as an example feedback loop in our first topic, but there's always some stimulus that causes the hormonal release. This just shows that the ADH is released from the posterior pituitary here when dehydration and low blood volume and blood pressure is sensed, And the two things they mention here is that we have water reabsorption, but we also mention here that we have vasoconstriction, so that the vessels do constrict a bit, so that that blood pressure doesn't go down, because the blood pressure is keeping that blood circulating and doing its nutrient and gas exchange. When the job is done, you can see that there's a negative feedback that will happen. And I have a way that I like to draw my feedback loops, and I would like you to all get a flashcards, or you need about a dozen, or you can get a piece of paper and just make your collection of feedback loops on that paper. This will be really an important thing to do, is to write them all out, because it does very much help you to memorize and remember all the parts of the feedback loops. So this is your first one that you want to write down. What the stimulus is dehydration and low blood pressure and low blood volume will cause the hypothalamus to release that. Remember, the hypothalamus makes the two posterior hormones with those, and they kind of trickle down on those secretory neurons. So that's why I actually made a wavy line here intentionally, that ADH is trickling down from the pituitary, from the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, and when these stimuli are detected, this process will happen, and the posterior pituitary will release that ADH into the bloodstream. The receptors will be blood vessels that will constrict when ADH hits them, and the kidney that will start reabsorbing water with its nephrons. Basically, the pores and the nephrons enlarge, and when the blood volume and blood pressure is back up, and the water content in the blood is back up, the negative feedback here will stop the hypothalamus and the pituitary. I just made a one arrow here. You can make arrow. Sometimes we just make the arrow. I'll show you with arrow going on both sides, saying let's stop the hypothalamus and let's stop the pituitary. So you can have two-sided arrow, or in this case I just made one, just it's quicker, I guess. I made one arrow going back like this to both of the parts of the brain at once. It's just a quicker way to make our feedback loops. And you make the negative sign that indicates that when the job is done, both brain parts are told to stop. The bottom of my little feedback loop images have the disorders, if there's applicable disorders. And in this case, if someone does not have release of ADH and has a deficiency in that, they could have diabetes insipidus, in which case they will, instead of keeping water, be losing large amounts of water and basically suffering severe dehydration. So make sure that you are recording these. The word antidiuretic, I wanted to mention, you have maybe heard of coffee or tea as being a diuretic, meaning that could make you lose water through your excretory system. So an antidiuretic is something like this hormone that helps you to keep water in your bloodstream, because it's an antidiuretic. A diuretic would mean you lose water. All right, let's go on to our second posterior pituitary hormone, and that's oxytocin. Oxytocin will be used by the female reproductive system during monthly cycles, and the uterine contractions help in the menstrual stage, and in addition, oxytocin is used for the uterine muscle contractions during childbirth. So you do have to remember that oxytocin affects the uterus for contracting. It's a muscle contractor. And later we'll talk about how prolactin is also, used for essentially reproductive function of making milk, but don't confuse that with oxytocin that contracts the uterus, but also contracts the mammaries to allow for milk letdown. And so milk isn't flowing freely all the time, but when a baby is nursing, there will be this muscle contraction, so it'll allow milk to flow through. And the pit drip, this is synthetic oxytocin that may help stimulate uterine contractions if someone is in labor and contractions aren't strong enough. This is an interesting concept about this, though, is that pretty much most of our feedback loops will be negative feedback loops, but this one, oxytocin, is actually a positive feedback loop because it will get stronger and stronger when someone is giving birth. Those uterine contractions don't just get done and stop, they will actually accelerate and get more frequent and stronger until the big event that the baby's born. So when we do this feedback loop, you will notice it's actually a positive feedback loop. Just fun fact that males actually do, even though they don't have a uterus or for females, similar to female functions, but they do make some oxytocin for other things like helping sperm be transported through the male reproductive system. And some interesting little trivia here that you can check out. Okay, let's go to oxytocin feedback loop. This will be the second one in your collection. And stimulus for this muscle contractor is when childbirth starts, or the baby's nursing, or the monthly female cycle. And just like the other one, hypothalamus is actually making that oxytocin. It is trickling down when needed into the posterior pituitary. This is the only two that this happens, where it trickles down from the hypothalamus. When these stimuli are detected, oxytocin will be put into the bloodstream and will be able to contract the uterus and do the milk letdown. And so you guys should record this second feedback loop. Okay, we are going to conclude our first lesson of 13.2, and we will be back for the second lesson of 13.2 coming up next. Bye for now.